Zorica, what I can say is that I always believe that we need to count on visionary approach and optimism that comes along with this geopolitical uncertainty and geoeconomic fragmentation, which translated when it comes to the European continent after the Russian invasion of Ukraine on completely different window of opportunity for the Western Balkans. And I believe that despite the fact that central banks, whether we have euro as a currency or currency boards in place or let's say more flexible monetary policy instruments in our hands, we still need to make sure that the title of this regional summit, which has to do with coordination, trust, transparency, is actually the most important. And when it comes to Montenegro as a Euroized economy, clearly we have our challenges. We do not participate in implementation of monetary policy of the ECB in decision making. We don't have tools at our disposal, monetary policy tools. We cannot influence interest rates. We cannot use quantitative tools. We cannot use exchange rate adjustment to address absorption of external shocks. But at the same time, I believe that all the constraints that we have actually even more exemplified the need that absence of monetary policy tools is translated into more responsibility and accountability at all levels and at all instances of decision makers in the country. And I believe that the current very complex geoeconomic and geopolitical environment is actually translating even more in an even more complex fashion and even more dynamic fashion on small open economies that don't have instruments of monetary policy like ours. So what I can say is, and I can refer to the most recent regional economic outlook and the world economic outlook published at the spring meetings of the IMF, which actually shows the discrepancy between when it comes to inflation, between the adjustment and disinflation trends in the countries of the Central Eastern and Southeastern Europe in the bloc that we belong to, and the euro area, whereas the euro area is expected to be at the target rate in the second half of 2025. With our economies, with the Montenegrin economy, with Central Eastern and Southeastern economies, the disinflation is expected to follow a much slower trend, and we are expected to see the convergence towards the target rate only in 26, 27. And yet again, with this level of uncertainty globally, with the escalation of trade wars and clearly everything heading in a direction which carries a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability, it's very difficult to envisage whether we are going to head in this direction and whether we will actually return to the uncertainty and increase of inflation due to complex geoeconomic environment. So with Montenegro on its own, without the possibility to use the monetary policy to adjust to external shocks, our strategy as a country, as society, as economy has to actually rest on other pillars, and some of them have been, well, gaining in solidity over the past years, such as fiscal recovery, where I will remind you all from 2020, year 2020 in pandemic period, when Montenegro had exposure of public debt being 105% of GDP. 3 consecutive governments have brought it down to the level of barely above 60%, which was the ending of the last year. But then again, this still dictates the need in the current geopolitical and geoeconomic complexity to build fiscal buffers. Because if you have a look at the projections of the IMF and the European Commission, and if you have a look at the spending, public spending, which will need to go definitely into the energy transition, defense, and infrastructure. If you, again, have a look at the latest IMF projection, which says that by 2050, you will have 8 percentage points increase in countries of our region in terms of adjustment to social, climate, defense needs, and again, having to raise public spending just points us in the direction of having to focus on very, let's say, conservative, tight, managed, disciplined fiscal policy, and the possibility to work in the years ahead in accumulating fiscal buffers for what is expected in the forthcoming period. When it comes to Montenegro, second area which is very relevant is targeted structural reforms. Again, I will revert to the IMF findings and recommendations when it comes to CESI region compared to the euro area on its own. We have significant untapped potential, and there is a projection that until 2025 we can have increment of 8 percentage points if we are to address reforms, structural reforms focused on skills, on institutions, on labor market, and the rule of law. So we absolutely have no more time to waste. We need to invest in making sure that we are going towards becoming fully fledged democracy and functioning market economy, and structural reforms are the only ones that can actually moderate the imported inflation over time. Again, something that I mentioned this morning in the introductory speech, deeper European integration. It's very relevant. We were talking about integrating financial ecosystem through SEPA and TIPS, and yes, we are heading in this direction, and I expect that July 2026 will mark the full integration. But then again, delivering on all economic chapters and financial chapters and securing equivalence with the European Union is something that can make our markets more credible and can actually assist in making sure that we can moderate imported inflation and stabilize our economy. And last but not the least, something that features over and over again. You cannot anchor expectations and you cannot sustain inflation unless you are credible and transparent and unless you communicate. So enhancing credibility and transparency of our institutions, building capacity, reinforcing independence of central banks, reinforcing excellent work which is done by the Ministry of Finance, making sure that there's more discipline within various other segments, and making sure that we, again, bring the digital services to several levels up, is something that guarantees that we can communicate and establish anchored expectations when it comes to inflation. So, all in all, Montenegro has no alternative. It needs to go in these directions, and not only in these. I will not dwell on implementation of ESG standards and greening our economy. I will not dwell again on making sure that the untapped potential in the female part of the labor force, which is in Montenegro most critical and the most underused and the least present in terms of active participation in the labor force, is again something that brings additional prosperity to the economy. And I'm absolutely convinced that with the fast pace in terms of regulatory adjustments, and we can all see that what we did was a major leap forward in terms of regulatory adjustments for the integration with the economic and financial ecosystem under SEPA and TIPS provisions, will ultimately lead us in the direction of higher accountability and more of let's say, responsible approach in terms of implementing all these other pillars in in the absence of monetary policy. And last but not the least, this is absolutely essential for Montenegro because Montenegro is particular. Montenegro is a country that is joining the EU without the precedent of joining the European Monetary Union because the current technical and legal framework envisages some elements of entering exchange rate mechanism with the euro, which Montenegro cannot comply with because it already uses the euro for 25 plus years. So the mere fact that we are heading towards EU membership and that we have another hurdle with the European Economic and Monetary Union where we cannot fit in the criteria unless we excel in performance in the other criteria, in fiscal criteria and clearly alignment on the interest rate and inflation has to put Montenegro on 2 steps above more responsible approach and more dynamic and efficient approach of all institutions. And this ultimately brings us to the first sentences that were delivered in the European Commission statement as of this morning, that economic governance, accountability, and independence of institutions is something that can bring the economy and society forward. And I do believe, I'm going to be optimistic, I do believe that our society does have the potential. I'm absolutely convinced, having spent all my 27 years of career in the public sector, in the government and the central bank, that we have critical mass of competent people. We only need political will and we need full consensus in society because all these reforms are not delivered by the central bank, by the government, by the parliament, by the civil society, by the media. They're delivered by the position or opposition. They're delivered by all of us, by the vision, by believing in where we want to be and with whom we want to be. And for Montenegro, I think we've made this goal very clear. Thank you.